I found my daughter begging on the freezing concrete, clutching my 3-year-old grandson against the pouring rain. When I dragged her into my truck, she handed me a crumpled envelope with shaking hands and whispered that her husband had been secretly drugging her coffee to fake an addiction, and he just took out a $2 million loan in her name. What happened next made my blood boil, and I realized I had to dismantle the man who broke my little girl piece by piece. My name is Frank Sullivan. I am 68 years old, and I am a retired diesel mechanic. I spent 40 years of my life pulling wrenches, rebuilding heavy engines, and breaking my back in the bitter cold of Ohio winters to provide for my family. I always thought I knew how to fix broken things. I always thought I understood how the world worked. But on a miserable, sleet-filled Tuesday evening last November, I found out I did not know a damn thing about the true face of evil. I was driving my old Ford pickup down Highway 42. The rain was coming down in thick, freezing sheets that turned the asphalt into a black mirror. I had just left the pharmacy with my heart medication, and all I wanted was to get back to my empty house. The heater in my truck was blasting, struggling to fight off the freezing draft seeping through the old weather stripping. I came to a stop at a long red light right in front of a rundown strip mall. It was the kind of desolate place with a flickering neon sign for a laundromat and a boarded-up grocery store. I sat there rubbing my tired, calloused hands against the steering wheel while listening to the rhythmic squeak of my windshield wipers. That is when I saw her. Under the sagging aluminum awning of the closed grocery store, a frail figure was huddled against the brick wall. It was a woman wearing a thin and soaking wet denim jacket. She was desperately trying to shield a toddler from the driving sleet. The wind was whipping around them without mercy. I could see her narrow shoulders shaking violently from 50 feet away. My chest tightened automatically. You never stop being a father even when your heart is broken. I squinted through the rain-streaked glass, feeling a strange and magnetic pull toward that desperate figure. A street lamp flickered above them, casting a harsh yellow glow on her face. My breath caught in my throat. My heart performed a violent and painful stumble against my ribs. It was Chloe, my daughter, my only child. I had not seen her face in 3 long and agonizing years. The last time we spoke, it ended in a massive shouting match that shattered our family. She was 25 at the time, head over heels in love with Trent Harrison. Trent was a slick real estate developer with perfectly manicured hands, expensive custom suits, and a polished smile that never quite reached his cold eyes. I told her he was a snake. I told her a man who looks down on people who work with their bare hands will eventually look down on her too. But she was young, blinded by his wealth and charm, and she chose him over me. She walked out of my house, married him, and cut me out of her life entirely. I missed her wedding. I missed the birth of my grandson, Leo. I spent 3 years sitting in my empty house, stubbornly holding on to my pride, waiting for a phone call that never came. But seeing her now practically freezing to death on a filthy sidewalk, all that pride evaporated into thin air. I slammed the truck into park right there in the middle of the intersection. I did not care about the blaring horns from the cars behind me. I threw open the door and ran through the freezing rain, my bad knees protesting with every single step. "Chloe!" I shouted over the howling wind. She flinched and pulled the toddler closer to her chest like a terrified animal. When she looked up and realized it was me, her sunken eyes widened in pure shock. Her face was gaunt, her cheekbones sharp and hollow, like she had not eaten a real meal in weeks. Her beautiful blonde hair was matted to her skull. She looked like a fragile ghost of the vibrant and strong-willed girl I had raised. "Dad," she choked out. Her teeth were chattering so violently she could barely form the word. I did not ask any questions. I grabbed her by the arm, scooped up my 3-year-old grandson in my other arm, and dragged them both toward my idling truck. The little boy Leo was freezing cold. His small lips were tinted a terrifying shade of blue. He buried his face into my heavy flannel coat, shivering uncontrollably. I threw open the passenger door, shoved them into the glorious heat of the cab, and ran back around to the driver's seat. I cranked the heat up to maximum and locked the doors. Chloe was sobbing loudly, a deep and guttural sound that tore my soul to shreds. I pulled an old wool blanket from behind the seat and wrapped it tightly around her and Leo. I just sat there for a moment, gripping the steering wheel, trying to process the absolute nightmare unfolding in my truck. My daughter, the wife of a supposed millionaire real estate mogul, was begging on the street on a Tuesday night in freezing rain. "Chloe, what is going on?" I demanded. My voice was rough with a mixture of fear and rising anger. "Where is your coat? Where is Trent? Why are you on the street?" She could not look me in the eye. Deep shame radiated from her shaking frame. She reached a trembling hand into the pocket of her soaked jeans and pulled out a crumpled and water-stained envelope. She handed it to me as if it weighed 1,000 pounds. "Read it," she whispered, her voice completely cracking. I turned on the overhead dome light. My hands were shaking as I tore open the envelope. Inside were several legal documents, thickly stamped and formally notarized. The first was a psychiatric evaluation from a doctor I had never heard of, declaring Chloe completely unfit, mentally unstable, and a severe danger to herself and her child. The second was an emergency eviction and temporary custody order granting Trent full and immediate custody of Leo, while physically barring Chloe from entering her own home. The third document made the blood freeze entirely in my veins. It was a commercial loan agreement for $2 million taken out entirely in Chloe's name, with her forged signature scribbled at the bottom. I stared at the papers, unable to comprehend the sheer magnitude of the betrayal. I looked over at my daughter. She was rocking Leo back and forth, tears streaming endlessly down her hollow cheeks. "Dad," she whispered, leaning closer so I could hear her over the blasting heater. Trent had been secretly drugging my coffee every single morning. He was putting high-dose sedatives in my cup to make me sleep all day, to make me slur my words, to make me look like I had a severe substance addiction. He orchestrated everything. He brought his own paid doctors to the house. He made everyone think I was losing my mind. And while I was completely incapacitated, he took out a $2 million loan using my identity. Today, he finalized the trap. He brought the police to the house, showed them the fake psychiatric evaluations, and they threw me out on the street with nothing but the clothes on my back. He told me if I tried to fight him, he would have me committed to a psychiatric ward permanently. I sat there while the crumpled papers in my hands felt like burning coals. My own son-in-law had poisoned my daughter. He had methodically and coldly destroyed her sanity, stolen her identity to secure a $2 million payout, and used the legal system to discard her like absolute trash. He thought he could break her and leave her in the gutter. He thought she had no one left to protect her, because I had been a stubborn and foolish old man for 3 years. The guilt hit me like a physical blow to the stomach. While I was sitting in my comfortable recliner holding on to my bruised ego, my little girl was being systematically tortured and robbed by a monster. Before I could even open my mouth to speak, before I could tell her how profoundly sorry I was, Chloe let out a blood-curdling scream. She pointed a shaking finger out the passenger window. "Dad, we have to go right now. He found us." I snapped my head up. Pulling into the far end of the strip mall parking lot was a massive black custom SUV. I recognized the obnoxious chrome grille instantly. It belonged to Trent's private security firm, the thugs he usually hired to intimidate his construction contractors. The SUV was crawling slowly through the empty lot, its high beams sweeping aggressively over the parked cars, actively hunting for a frail woman and a toddler. Trent had not just thrown her out. He was hunting her down. He probably realized she managed to take the envelope with the forged loan documents when she grabbed her things. If his goons caught her now, they would drag her straight to a psychiatric hold, take my grandson away forever, and silence her completely. I did not hesitate for a single second. 40 years of turning wrenches and driving heavy machinery kicks in fast when your family is threatened. I slammed the gear shift into drive, killed my headlights so we would not be spotted immediately, and stomped heavily on the gas pedal. The heavy Ford truck surged forward, its tires spinning for a fraction of a second on the icy asphalt before gripping hard. "Dad! They are going to see us!" Chloe cried out. She was shielding Leo with her entire body as if bracing for a violent impact. "Hold on tight, girl," I growled with my jaw locked tight. I steered the truck behind the abandoned grocery store, navigating the pitch-black alleyway by memory alone. I knew these roads. I knew every crack, every pothole, and every blind corner of this town long before Trent Harrison ever set foot in it with his slick suits and dirty money. We burst out of the alley onto a narrow access road just as the black SUV rounded the front of the building. Their blinding high beams flashed across my rearview mirror. They had spotted the truck. I hit my headlights and floored the accelerator. The heavy diesel engine roared to life, violently shaking the floorboards beneath my boots. The access road was incredibly slick, with freezing rain winding dangerously through a dense patch of skeletal winter trees. I kept my eyes glued to the dark road ahead, pushing the old truck to its absolute limit. In the mirror, the SUV was accelerating aggressively, violently swerving to catch up to us. They had a faster and much more modern vehicle, but those city thugs did not know how to drive in a Midwestern ice storm. I did. I approached a sharp and blind curve near the old municipal reservoir. I knew for a fact that the shoulder dropped off into a steep, muddy ditch. I tapped my brakes lightly, shifting the massive weight of the truck, and drifted through the turn with the precision of a man who had driven that exact road 1,000 times. The SUV behind us tried to mimic the maneuver at a much higher speed. I heard the sickening screech of their anti-lock brakes completely failing on the black ice. In my rearview mirror, I watched the massive black SUV lose traction, spin wildly out of control, and slam front first into the deep and muddy embankment. Their headlights tilted up into the trees, illuminating the pouring rain. They were stuck deep in the mud. I did not slow down. I drove for another 20 miles, taking a convoluted maze of back roads, dirt paths, and industrial routes until I was absolutely certain we were not being followed by anyone else. The adrenaline was pumping through my veins so hard that my hands ached as they gripped the steering wheel. Chloe was weeping silently in the passenger seat, while rocking a fast-asleep Leo in her arms. I finally pulled into the driveway of my small and secluded house on the edge of town. I parked the truck in the detached garage and killed the engine. The sudden silence in the cab was deafening, save for the rhythmic pinging of the cooling diesel engine. I turned to my daughter. Her face was pale, completely exhausted, and utterly defeated. She looked at me quietly, waiting for the judgment, waiting for me to say I told you so. I unbuckled my seatbelt, reached over the center console, and pulled her into my arms. I hugged her tighter than I ever had in my entire life. "I am so sorry I let this happen to you, Chloe," I whispered into her wet hair. "I am so sorry I was not there to protect you, but I promise you right here and right now, as long as there is breath in my lungs, that man will pay for every single tear you shed tonight." We stepped out of the truck and walked toward the front door of my house, hoping to finally get some warmth and safety for the night. But the nightmare was far from over, because the very moment I unlocked the front door and pushed it open, my living room windows were suddenly illuminated by a terrifying sea of flashing red and blue lights. We had barely stepped foot into the warmth of my living room when the nightmare caught up to us. I remember the sound of the front door clicking shut. Felt like the heaviest lock in the world, sealing us away from the freezing Ohio downpour. I took my soaked coat off and wrapped another dry quilt around Chloe and little Leo. The boy was finally starting to get some color back into his cheeks. I walked toward the kitchen to put on a pot of coffee to warm our bones. I did not even make it past the hallway. Harsh red and blue lights suddenly and violently sliced through the front windows. They painted the walls of my quiet home in terrifying, flashing colors. Chloe screamed. It was not a loud noise, but a high-pitched sound of pure, trapped terror. She dropped to her knees right there on the living room rug, clutching Leo so hard the boy started to cry. "Dad, they are here," she gasped out, rocking back and forth. "Trent sent them. He is going to lock me away. He is going to take my baby." I moved to the window and carefully pulled back the edge of the heavy curtain. 3 police cruisers were parked at steep angles across my front lawn and driveway. The freezing rain was illuminated by their spotlights pointing directly at my front door. Officers were stepping out of their vehicles with the heavy hoods of their raincoats pulled up and their hands resting firmly on their duty belts. My stomach dropped into a cold, bottomless pit. Trent had not just sent his private security goons after us. He had weaponized the local police. The pounding on my front door was loud enough to shake the picture frames on the walls. It was the kind of authoritative knock that demanded immediate submission. "Police department. Open the door." Chloe grabbed my ankle. Her eyes were completely wild with a fear I had never seen in a human being before. "Please, Dad, do not let them take me," she begged. "Do not let them take my son." I knelt down to her level and placed my rough, calloused hands on her shaking shoulders. I looked her dead in the eye and spoke with a calm and steady authority. "Nobody is taking you anywhere tonight, Chloe. You are in my house now. You stay right here on the floor, out of sight. I will handle this." I stood up and grabbed the crumpled envelope she had given me in the truck. I smoothed out the wet edges of the forged documents and tucked them firmly into my back pocket. I took a deep breath, letting the air fill my tired lungs. I am an old diesel mechanic. I am a veteran. I have faced down broken engines, massive debts, and the freezing cold of winter. I was not about to let a slick, suited monster use the law to steal my family. I unlocked the deadbolt and pulled the heavy wooden door open, stepping out onto the covered porch and closing the door tightly behind me to shield my daughter. The blinding beam of a police spotlight hit my face immediately. I held up my hands calmly so they could see I was unarmed. Frank Sullivan stepped slowly down from the porch. An officer shouted over the pouring rain. "Keep your hands where we can see them." I did not step down. I stood my ground on the wooden planks of my own home, staring out into the blinding light. "Officers," I said, my voice booming over the storm. "I am completely unarmed. I am standing on my own property. I am asking you to turn that spotlight down so I can look you in the eye like a man." There was a tense silence for a few seconds. The rain beat down on the wooden roof above my head. Finally, the blinding white light clicked off. I could see 4 officers standing in a wide semicircle around my porch. 2 of them had their hands resting on their holsters. The man in the center stepped forward. He was a tall guy wearing a sergeant badge. "Mr. Sullivan," the sergeant said, his tone deadly serious. "We received a frantic emergency call from your son-in-law, Trent Harrison. He filed an active Amber Alert for his son, Leo. He claims you forcefully kidnapped the boy and that your daughter Chloe is currently suffering from a severe drug-induced psychotic break. We have a standing court order granting him immediate physical custody of the child. We need you to hand the boy over right now." The sheer audacity of the lie made my blood boil hot enough to melt steel. Trent had orchestrated this perfectly. He painted me as an estranged and violent father who stole a child, and he painted his wife as a crazed drug addict. He knew the police would act fast on an Amber Alert. He was using the badge to do his dirty work. "Sergeant," I said, keeping my voice absolutely even. "Look at me. Take a real good look at me. My name is Frank Sullivan. I have lived in this town for 40 years. I served in the United States Army. I have run the diesel repair shop on Main Street for decades. I have fixed the engines on half the school buses your kids ride in. Do I look like a man who goes around kidnapping children?" The sergeant frowned. He took a slow step forward, rain dripping from his hat. "I know who you are, Frank. I know your reputation. But I have an emergency dispatch reporting a kidnapped child and a mother who is a danger to herself. Mr. Harrison provided medical documentation to the dispatcher." I reached slowly into my back pocket, pulling out the crumpled envelope. The officers tensed but relaxed when they saw the paper. I unfolded the documents and held them out. "Medical documentation? You mean this garbage?" I asked. "Trent Harrison did not provide you with medical documentation. He provided you with forged papers to cover up a $2 million commercial loan he just stole in my daughter's name. You want to talk about danger to herself. The only danger to my daughter is the man who spent the last month secretly poisoning her coffee with heavy sedatives so he could steal her identity and lock her out of her own home." The sergeant approached the porch and took the damp papers from my hand. He shined a small flashlight on the documents, shielding them from the rain. I pointed a thick, grease-stained finger at the dates on the pages. "Look at the dates, Sergeant," I pressed. "The psychiatric evaluation claims my daughter has been completely incapacitated and raving mad for weeks. Yet the commercial loan agreement for $2 million was signed by her supposedly yesterday. How does a woman who is completely out of her mind negotiate and sign for a $2 million commercial loan? And look at the emergency eviction order. It was stamped this morning. Trent Harrison threw his wife and his freezing child out onto the street in the middle of an ice storm, and then called you to claim they were kidnapped. I found them begging under an awning at the abandoned grocery store an hour ago." The sergeant read the papers, his eyes narrowing as he processed the glaring contradictions. The timeline made absolutely no sense, and any seasoned cop could smell a bad story when it was shoved in their face. I knew I had cracked his absolute certainty, but I needed to seal the deal. I turned slightly and cracked the front door open just a few inches. "Chloe," I called out softly. "Come here, baby. Show them you are safe." The door creaked open further. Chloe stepped into the dim porch light, carrying Leo tightly against her chest. She was trembling visibly from the cold and the residual shock of the drugs in her system, but she stood tall. She did not look like a raving lunatic. She looked like a battered, terrified mother, holding on to the only thing she had left in the world. "Officers," she said, her voice shaky but clear. "My father did not kidnap us. He saved us. My husband poisoned me. He stole my identity and he threw us out into the rain. If you send my baby back to him, I will never see him again. Please. You have to believe me." The officers lowered their hands from their belts. The tension in the front yard seemed to wash away with the freezing rain. The sergeant let out a long, heavy sigh and handed the documents back to me. He looked at Chloe and the shivering boy, and then looked back at my hardened face. "Mr. Sullivan," the sergeant said, rubbing his jaw, "this is a massive legal mess, and I am not a judge. I see the discrepancies in the dates, and I can see your daughter is scared to death, not crazy. But Trent Harrison still has a signed emergency custody order from a judge. I am putting my neck on the line by not enforcing it tonight." "Then put it on the line," I demanded fiercely. "You know what is right here. You know bringing a child out into this storm to hand him over to a man who lied on a police dispatch is wrong." The sergeant nodded slowly. "All right, Frank. I am going to call off the Amber Alert. I will report that we made contact and verified the child is safe with his grandfather and his biological mother. I will let them stay here for the night. But you need to listen to me very carefully." He stepped closer, leaning in so only I could hear his next words. I am filing this as a civil dispute pending a formal wellness check in the morning. But Trent Harrison has money, and he has lawyers. By tomorrow afternoon, he is going to go to a family court judge and demand police enforcement of that custody order. You have bought yourself a few hours, Frank. But the clock is ticking. You need a lawyer, and you need ironclad proof by tomorrow, or I will have no choice but to come back here and execute the judge's orders. I nodded, my jaw set like stone. I understand, Sergeant. Thank you. The officers walked back to their cruisers. The heavy doors slammed shut, and one by one the blinding flashing lights turned off. The police vehicles backed slowly out of my driveway and disappeared down the dark, wet street. I stood on the porch for a long time, watching the taillights fade into the miserable Ohio storm. The freezing wind bit through my thin shirt, but I barely felt it. My mind was racing at 1,000 miles an hour, analyzing the completely new battlefield I had just been thrown onto. Trent Harrison was not coming at me with his fists. He was a coward who hid behind expensive suits and manipulated systems. He was using fraudulent legal papers, dirty doctors, and corrupt connections to crush my daughter. He thought that because I was a simple retired mechanic with grease under my fingernails, I would just bow down to a piece of paper with a judge's stamp on it. He thought wrong. I walked back inside and locked the deadbolt. Chloe was sitting on the couch, wrapped in the quilt, rocking a sleeping Leo. She looked up at me with exhausted, tear-filled eyes. "What happens now, Dad?" she whispered. I walked into the kitchen and finally started the coffee pot. I leaned my heavy hands against the Formica countertop, staring out the window into the black night. The physical evasion was over. I had outdriven his goons on the back roads, but you cannot outdrive a federal court order. The conflict had just shifted from the muddy streets to a terrifying legal ticking clock. I had until tomorrow to dismantle his lies before he took my grandson away permanently. I walked back into the living room and sat down heavily on the coffee table right in front of my daughter. What happens now is that we fight back. I said, my voice low and completely unshakable. He thinks he can use the law to break you, but he forgot who raised you. He forgot that I know how to take a broken machine apart piece by piece. You get some sleep, Chloe. Tomorrow morning we are going to start tearing Trent Harrison's life apart. I barely closed my eyes that night. I sat in the worn armchair by the front window, with a heavy steel wrench resting on my lap, just listening to the wind howl and waiting for the sun to rise. I thought we had made it through the worst part of the storm, but the nightmare was only changing its shape. Just before dawn, I heard a terrible crash from the guest bedroom. I dropped the wrench and sprinted down the hallway, pushing the door open. Chloe was on the floor. Her body was convulsing, and she was gasping for air, as if she were drowning on dry land. She had knocked over the bedside lamp in her panic. Little Leo was sitting on the mattress, clutching his blanket and crying softly in the dark. I dropped to my knees and gathered my daughter into my arms. Her skin was freezing cold, but she was sweating profusely. Her teeth chattered so hard I thought they might shatter right there in my hands. I held her tight, smoothing her damp hair and asking what was happening. She could barely string a sentence together. Her eyes were rolling back and her limbs jerked uncontrollably. "Dad," she choked out, clutching my heavy flannel shirt. "My chest is burning. I feel like I am dying." It was the withdrawal. Trent had been slipping her massive daily doses of heavy sedatives to keep her compliant and to build his fake psychiatric case against her. Now that she was away from his poisoned coffee, her body was crashing violently. Her nervous system was screaming for the chemicals she did not even know she was addicted to. My first instinct was to call an ambulance, but my mind immediately slammed the brakes on that idea. Trent Harrison was a massive donor to our local hospital. He played golf with the hospital administrators. He had the local police in his pocket. If I took her to the emergency room in our town, Trent would have a doctor on his payroll declare her a drug addict and lock her in a psychiatric ward before the sun even fully cleared the horizon. He would use her withdrawal symptoms as the final proof that she was an unfit mother, and then he would take my grandson away forever. I could not let that happen. I scooped Chloe up in my arms. I told her to hold on just a little longer. I grabbed Leo and wrapped him in a heavy quilt and carried them both out to the truck. The freezing rain from the night before had turned into a thick layer of morning frost, but I did not care. I fired up the diesel engine and drove straight out of town. We crossed the county line just as the morning light began to turn the sky a pale, miserable gray. I drove 30 miles away from Trent's sphere of influence to a small, independent urgent care clinic nestled in a quiet, rural community. It was the kind of place where working-class folks went when they could not afford the big city hospitals. I knew the doctors here answered to the state medical board, not to a slick real estate developer with a fat checkbook. I carried Chloe through the sliding glass doors and demanded immediate medical attention. The nurses took one look at her convulsing frame and rushed her into the back on a wheelchair. I sat in the sterile waiting room with its harsh fluorescent lights and cheap plastic chairs. Leo was exhausted, still wrapped in his quilt, and he finally fell asleep, resting his small head against my broad chest. I sat there rubbing his back with my grease-stained hand, feeling a profound mixture of absolute rage and crushing guilt. How did I not see this coming? How did I let my daughter fall into the clutches of a family so deeply corrupted by greed and malice? As I stared at the blank television screen mounted on the clinic wall, my mind drifted back 3 years to Chloe and Trent's wedding day. It was a lavish, over-the-top affair at a country club that I could never afford to step foot in on my own. I remembered the exact moment I knew Trent's family was rotten to the core. It was during the reception when I had the displeasure of sitting across from his mother, Beverly Harrison. Beverly was a woman who wore her wealth like a weapon. She was draped in expensive silk and diamonds that sparkled under the chandelier. When I reached out to shake her hand, she looked at my calloused, scarred fingers as if I had just offered her a fistful of garbage. She did not even try to hide her disgust. She gave me a tight, condescending smile and asked if I had managed to scrub the diesel oil out from under my nails before putting on my rented suit. I bit my tongue that day for Chloe's sake, but Beverly's arrogant laughter had echoed in my mind ever since. Beverly was not just a wealthy snob. She was a senior vice president at a massive regional bank. She controlled commercial lending and oversaw multi-million-dollar asset portfolios for the entire state. As I sat in that clinic waiting room holding my grandson, the pieces of this terrifying puzzle suddenly clicked together with sickening clarity. Trent was not building his real estate empire on his own merit. He was using his mother's banking connections to secure massive loans. That is how he had the power to process a fraudulent $2 million commercial loan in my daughter's name. Beverly was the architect. Trent was the executioner. They looked down on us as blue-collar trash. They thought we were stupid. They thought Chloe was nothing more than a convenient scapegoat, a disposable asset they could drug, manipulate, and throw away to take the fall for their financial crimes. My jaw tightened so hard my teeth ached. They had underestimated the wrong mechanic. A tired-looking doctor in a white lab coat finally walked out into the waiting area holding a clipboard. He called my name, and I stood up, carefully shifting Leo into my left arm so I would not wake him. The doctor had a grim expression on his face. He told me that Chloe was stabilized. They had given her intravenous fluids and medication to safely manage her severe withdrawal symptoms. But then he looked me dead in the eye and asked me exactly what she had been taking. I told him the absolute truth. I said she had not been taking anything voluntarily. I told him her husband had been secretly poisoning her morning coffee for the last month. The doctor let out a long, heavy sigh and tapped his pen against the clipboard. He told me the toxicology blood panel came back with terrifying results. Chloe had absolutely massive concentrated amounts of a highly potent prescription sedative in her bloodstream. It was a heavy benzodiazepine typically used for severe panic disorders or pre-surgical anesthesia. The doctor explained that the dosage in her system was not something a recreational user would take. It was a calculated continuous dose designed to induce extreme lethargy, memory loss, and physical incapacitation. It was a dose meant to completely subdue a human being. I felt a cold shiver run down my spine, but right behind it came a massive wave of vindication. We were no longer fighting against whispers and rumors. We had undeniable scientific proof. I looked the doctor square in the face and asked him to print out the official certified toxicology report. I needed it signed and dated by the clinic administrator. I needed it documented that she was brought in suffering from involuntary acute poisoning. The doctor nodded gravely and said he was required by law to document the exact nature of the chemicals in her blood. He promised to hand me the certified records immediately. This was our sword and our shield. Trent's forged psychiatric evaluations claimed Chloe was naturally losing her mind, but this independent blood test proved he was chemically dismantling her brain to steal $2 million. The doctor led me back to a small recovery room. Chloe was lying on a crisp white hospital bed, looking paler than a ghost, but the violent shaking had finally stopped. She looked at me with heavy, exhausted eyes and whispered a soft thank you. I kissed her forehead and told her she was completely safe now. The nurse came in a few minutes later and said they were ready to discharge her with a prescription to help taper off the remaining drugs in her system safely. She pointed us toward the billing counter at the front of the clinic to settle the outpatient copay before we left. I helped Chloe out of the bed, wrapping my heavy coat around her shoulders while holding Leo by the hand. We walked slowly down the hallway to the front desk. The billing clerk, a young woman with a kind smile, typed something into her computer and asked for a simple $10 copay to finalize the paperwork and hand over the certified medical records. Chloe reached into her damp jeans pocket and pulled out her debit card with a trembling hand. She handed it to the clerk with an apologetic smile. The clerk ran the card through the machine. The machine beeped a harsh metallic sound. The clerk frowned and ran it again. "I am so sorry, honey," the clerk said softly. "The card is declining. It says the account has been frozen by the primary account holder." Chloe closed her eyes and let out a broken sigh. Trent had not wasted a single minute. The moment he kicked her out, he contacted the bank his mother practically ran and completely froze Chloe out of every single joint account they shared. He was trying to starve her into submission. He wanted her to have absolutely zero resources to fight back or even buy a meal for her son. I put my hand on my daughter's shoulder and squeezed it gently. I told her not to worry about a thing. I told her her father had worked hard his entire life, specifically so he could take care of his family on a rainy day. I reached into my leather wallet and pulled out my own debit card. I felt a surge of pride knowing I had my reliable pension and a solid emergency savings account built up over 40 years of turning wrenches and breaking my knuckles. I handed my card to the clerk and told her to put the entire clinic bill on my account, not just the copay. The clerk smiled warmly and swiped my card. But then the machine beeped again. That same harsh, metallic sound echoed in the quiet lobby. The clerk looked at her screen, and her smile faded into a look of absolute confusion. "Sir," she said, looking up at me hesitantly, "your card is declining too. It says insufficient funds." I stared at the clerk, unable to comprehend her words. I told her to run it again, stating there had to be a mistake. I had over $60,000 sitting in that checking account from my retirement savings. There was absolutely no way it was declining a $10 charge. The clerk swiped it a third time and shook her head. "I am sorry, sir," she whispered. "The bank is completely rejecting the transaction." I pulled my phone out of my pocket with a sudden rising panic gripping my chest. I opened my banking application and logged into my account. The screen loaded, and the numbers appeared in bright, glaring text. My checking account balance was zero. My savings account balance was zero. Even the small reserve account I kept for my property taxes had been completely wiped clean. I stood there in the middle of the rural clinic staring at the glaring zeros on my screen, while the air was sucked entirely out of the room. Trent Harrison had not just frozen his wife out. He and his mother Beverly had used the fraudulent guardianship and eviction court orders combined with their immense power at the regional bank to completely freeze and drain my assets, too. They had declared me a violent kidnapper to the police and an accomplice to a mentally unstable woman to the financial institutions. Trent had weaponized the entire system against me in less than 12 hours. He wanted to make sure I could not hire a lawyer. He wanted to make sure I could not even buy my daughter a bottle of water or a $10 medical document. He thought he could strip away 40 years of my hard-earned dignity with a few keystrokes and a forged judge's signature. He thought making me completely penniless would force me to surrender my daughter and my grandson to his twisted criminal scheme. I looked down at my empty hands and then over to my terrified daughter. Trent Harrison had just crossed a line that no man should ever cross. The fight was no longer just about survival. It was about utter destruction. And he was about to learn exactly what a man with nothing left to lose is truly capable of doing. I stood in the lobby of that rural clinic staring at the glaring red zeros on my banking application. It felt as if all the oxygen had been sucked straight out of the room. Trent Harrison had not just targeted my daughter. He had reached his greedy manicured fingers right into my life and choked the life out of my finances. I am a man who planned for everything. I worked 40 years pulling heavy diesel engines apart so I would never have to beg anyone for a single dime. Now my checking account, my savings account, and my hard-earned pension were entirely wiped out. I pulled the young clinic clerk aside and begged her to give me 10 minutes. I walked out into the freezing morning air and called my bank. The representative on the phone sounded nervous and evasive. She told me that a sweeping medical guardianship order had been filed at dawn. Trent and his mother Beverly had used a fraudulent court order claiming Chloe was dangerously unstable. Because she was residing under my roof, they filed an emergency injunction tying my personal assets to her medical liability. Beverly had used her senior vice president status at the regional bank to fast-track the freeze overriding every standard security protocol. They locked up every single penny I owned in the blink of an eye. I hung up the phone and looked through the glass doors of the clinic. Chloe was sitting in a cheap plastic chair, looking incredibly small and fragile, while holding little Leo tightly against her chest. She had absolutely nothing. And now on paper I had nothing either. But Trent and Beverly made one massive miscalculation. They thought money was the only kind of power that mattered in this world. They thought freezing a working man out of his bank account would break his spirit and force him to surrender. I walked back inside and looked at the clerk. I took off my heavy gold watch. It was a retirement gift from my local mechanics union, and the only thing of value I had on my person. I placed it gently on the counter and told her to keep it as collateral until I came back with cash. The clerk pushed the watch back toward me with tears welling in her eyes. She told me her own father had been a mechanic, and she told me to just take the medical records and go take care of my girl. I thanked her from the bottom of my heart. I grabbed the certified toxicology report, folded it carefully into my pocket, and guided my daughter and my grandson out the clinic doors. We climbed back into my cold truck. The heater roared to life, blowing warm air over us, but the chill resting deep in my bones had absolutely nothing to do with the winter weather. Chloe looked over at me with heavy, exhausted eyes. "Dad," she whispered, her voice cracking and weak. "What is wrong? Why did your card decline?" I looked at my little girl and forced the most confident smile I could muster. "It is just a bank error, sweetie." I lied smoothly, protecting her from the panic. "It is nothing your old man cannot handle. You just rest your eyes. We have a few stops to make." I put the heavy truck in gear and pulled out onto the wet highway. My mind was burning with a righteous, white-hot fury. Trent thought he had completely outmaneuvered me. He had the local police on speed dial. He had the regional banks eating out of the palm of his hand. He had fraudulent judges stamping emergency orders in the middle of the night. If I tried to fight him through the normal legal channels, he would bury me in expensive red tape until I suffocated. I needed someone who knew exactly how to operate in the shadows. I needed a man who understood how to dismantle a corrupt system from the inside out. I drove straight past my neighborhood and headed toward the dilapidated industrial edge of town. Tucked away behind an abandoned lumber yard was a rusting, corrugated steel building surrounded by a tall chain-link fence. The faded painted sign above the bay doors was barely readable, but it said Mitchell's Auto Repair. I pulled my truck through the open gate and parked near a massive stack of discarded tractor tires. Mitchell was my oldest and best friend in the entire world. We had served together in the military decades ago. While I spent my life turning wrenches on civilian diesel rigs, Mitchell had spent his entire military career as a highly specialized investigator. He tracked down missing supplies, busted massive corruption rings, and understood the deep, dark underbelly of financial fraud better than anyone. When he retired, he opened this rundown garage to tinker with classic cars, but I knew his back office operated like the command center of a stealth submarine. I stepped out of the truck and walked into the dimly lit garage. The air smelled of motor oil and stale coffee. Mitchell was underneath a rusted-out Chevy, holding a welding torch. He slid out on his creeper board, wiped the thick grease from his forehead, and gave me a highly confused look. "Frank," he grunted, his rough voice echoing in the large space. "What in the world are you doing here before noon?" I did not smile. I told him I needed his help right now, and it was a matter of life or death. Mitchell took one look at my hardened face and immediately dropped his tools. I walked back out and brought Chloe and Leo inside. When Mitchell saw my daughter looking like a battered, starving ghost, his jaw clenched tight. He had known Chloe since she was a little girl running around my shop in dirty overalls. Without asking a single question, Mitchell led us into his secure back office. He turned on a small space heater and pulled a heavy wool blanket out of a supply closet for Leo. He locked the heavy steel door behind us and turned to me. "Talk," he demanded, crossing his muscular arms. I handed him the certified toxicology report from the clinic and the forged court documents Chloe had smuggled out. I told him everything. I told him how Trent had been slowly poisoning my daughter for a month, how Beverly froze my life savings this morning, and how they were using the local police to hunt us down like animals. Mitchell's eyes grew dark and incredibly cold as he read through the fabricated psychiatric papers. He walked over to a massive metal desk in the corner of the room. Beneath the greasy auto parts and scattered spark plugs was a bank of high-end computer monitors that looked completely out of place in a dusty garage. Mitchell cracked his knuckles and sat down at the keyboard. He told me that slick corporate guys like Trent Harrison always leave a digital footprint because arrogance makes them extremely sloppy. If Trent took out a $2 million commercial loan in Chloe's name, the money had to go somewhere fast. Mitchell launched a series of secure proxy networks diving deep into public records, commercial real estate filings, and global banking registries. The rapid clacking of his keyboard filled the quiet room, while Chloe slept on a ragged leather sofa with Leo curled tightly against her chest. We waited in tense silence for nearly 2 hours. I paced the concrete floor, drinking bitter black coffee from a styrofoam cup. Finally, Mitchell stopped typing. He let out a low whistle and leaned back in his squeaky desk chair. "Frank, you need to see this," he said grimly, pointing at his primary screen. I stood over his shoulder, staring at a massive, complex web of financial documents and wire transfers highlighted in bright red on the monitor. Mitchell pointed to a series of offshore holding accounts and domestic shell companies. "Trent is not a successful real estate developer," Mitchell explained, his voice thick with absolute disgust. "He is completely broke. He is drowning in millions of dollars of toxic debt from 3 massive failed commercial projects. His high-profile investors have been demanding their returns for months, and Trent has been borrowing money from very dangerous people to pay off the early investors. He is running a massive real estate Ponzi scheme, and his entire house of cards is about to collapse." I felt a sickening wave of realization wash over me. I looked at the digital copy of the $2 million loan document bearing my daughter's forged signature. "So what is this specific loan for?" I asked, my voice trembling with an anger I could barely contain. Mitchell pulled up another screen. It showed the state registration documents for 4 different dummy corporations. All 4 companies were registered entirely under Chloe's name. Trent used the fraudulent $2 million loan to pay off his most aggressive and dangerous creditors, Mitchell said, tracing the money path with his finger. But he funneled the money entirely through companies legally owned by your daughter. He forged her signature on every single wire transfer. When the federal authorities eventually realize this is a massive Ponzi scheme, the entire paper trail will point directly to Chloe. On paper, she will look like the criminal mastermind who stole millions from innocent investors. I gripped the cold edge of the metal desk so hard my knuckles turned completely white. It all made perfect and terrifying sense now. "That is why he was poisoning her," I whispered, my throat tight with absolute horror. "He needed her incapacitated. He needed to be able to sign legal papers in her name without her ever knowing what was happening. And that is why he got those fake psychiatric evaluations," Mitchell added gravely, looking up at me. "Think about it, Frank. When the federal investigators finally come knocking, Trent can play the innocent, devastated husband. He will hand them the psychiatric reports and claim his wife suffered a severe mental breakdown and orchestrated the massive fraud while she was completely out of her mind. He needs her permanently locked away in a psychiatric ward. Or worse, he needs her dead. If she is declared legally insane, she takes the absolute blame. The federal government locks her up and Trent walks away totally clean, keeping whatever stolen cash he has hidden in offshore accounts. He is using your innocent daughter as a human shield to stay out of a federal penitentiary. The sheer magnitude of the evil I was looking at made my stomach churn violently. Trent Harrison was not just a greedy snob who looked down on blue-collar workers. He was a sociopathic monster, willing to chemically lobotomize the mother of his own child just to save his own skin. He was willing to let Chloe rot in a federal prison or a padded cell while he lived a life of absolute luxury. And Beverly, his smug, arrogant mother, was sitting at her executive desk, pulling the banking strings and clearing the fraudulent transfers just to protect her precious criminal son. I turned around and looked at my daughter sleeping on the sofa. She was breathing softly, her pale face finally resting peacefully after weeks of relentless chemical torture. She was totally innocent. She had loved him deeply. She had trusted him to protect her and to build a beautiful family together. And he had treated her like a disposable piece of trash to be thrown into an incinerator the moment he needed an escape route. I felt a heat rise in my chest that I had never felt in my 68 years of life. It was a pure, unfiltered and righteous fury. I looked back at the computer screens displaying Trent's entire fragile financial empire. He thought he could steal everything from us and walk away without a scratch. He thought because he wore a $5,000 suit and drove a luxury car, he was completely untouchable. Mitchell looked up at me from his chair. His old military eyes were sharp-focused and completely ready for a war. "What do we do now, Frank?" he asked quietly. I stood up straight, rolling my heavy shoulders back. I wiped the grease and sweat from my brow. "I want everything." "Mitchell." I growled, my voice echoing off the steel walls. "I want every bank account number, every hidden asset, every single forged signature, and every offshore transfer he ever made in his miserable life. Print it all out. Put it in a binder. Trent Harrison thinks he built a foolproof trap to destroy my little girl. But he made one fatal mistake. He left her father alive. I am going to take all this evidence, and I am going to dismantle his perfect, pristine life. I am going to burn his fake empire to the ground, and I am going to make sure he and his mother spend the rest of their miserable lives rotting in a cold federal cell." I left Chloe sleeping safely on the worn leather sofa in the back office of Mitchell's garage. Her body was finally resting after the violent nightmare of the chemical withdrawal. She needed quiet, and she needed time to heal. But my 3-year-old grandson, Leo, had woken up hungry. The poor boy had not eaten a warm meal since Trent and his security thugs threw them out into the freezing storm. I promised Mitchell I would be quick. I carried Leo down the wet sidewalk to a run-down, greasy spoon diner called Pete's, just 2 blocks away from the garage. We sat in a cracked vinyl booth near the back by the restrooms. The diner smelled like stale coffee, burnt bacon, and old bleach. It was exactly the kind of place Trent Harrison and his wealthy family would never dare to step foot inside. Leo was sitting across from me, happily coloring on a paper placemat with a broken red crayon. I reached into the deep pocket of my heavy flannel coat and pulled out a handful of loose change. I placed the coins on the scratched Formica table and started counting them out with my thick, calloused fingers. Quarters and dimes and a few nickels. I pushed them into a small pile. $4.35. That was the grand total of my available wealth. It was literally all the money I had left in the entire world since Beverly Harrison used her banking power to completely freeze my pension and wipe out my life savings. I ordered Leo a grilled cheese sandwich and a small glass of milk. My own stomach was roaring with hunger. I had not eaten anything in 24 hours, but I told the tired waitress I just wanted a simple cup of black coffee. I watched my beautiful grandson take a big bite of the buttery toast. A small smile finally returned to his innocent face. I felt a massive wave of protective love wash over me. I also felt a deep and burning rage. I had worked 40 hard years pulling heavy diesel engines apart so my family would never go hungry. And now I was counting dirty pennies on a sticky table just to feed my own flesh and blood. But I knew I just had to hold the line. Mitchell was working on the financial trace back at his shop. We were building our case. The brass bell above the diner door jingled loudly. A heavy blast of freezing Ohio winter wind swept through the small restaurant. I did not look up right away. I was busy wiping a spot of ketchup off Leo's cheek. But the sudden total silence in the room made me raise my eyes. The few truck drivers and construction workers sitting at the front counter had completely stopped talking. They were all staring at the woman who had just walked through the door. It was Beverly Harrison, Trent's mother. She looked completely absurd standing in a run-down blue-collar diner. She was wearing a pristine white cashmere winter coat that probably cost more than my entire truck. Heavy diamond earrings sparkled aggressively under the flickering fluorescent lights. Her perfectly manicured hands clutched a designer leather handbag. She scanned the room with a look of absolute disgust as if the very air in the building was contaminating her lungs. Then her cold, calculating shark eyes locked directly onto my booth. A smug, victorious smile spread across her heavily powdered face. She walked slowly toward us. Her expensive high heels clicked sharply against the scuffed linoleum floor. Every single step she took felt like a calculated strike against my dignity. Beverly slid into the booth right across from me. She did not bother to take off her coat. She did not even acknowledge my grandson sitting right next to me. She just stared at me with eyes devoid of any human warmth. "You look terrible, Frank," she said, her voice dripping with fake pity. "You look like a tired old man who has finally realized he is completely out of his depth." I kept my face completely blank. I had expected them to come after me, but I did not expect the architect of the entire criminal operation to walk right up to my table. I slouched my heavy shoulders forward and let out a long, defeated sigh. I knew instantly that I needed to play a very specific part. I needed to be the broken, exhausted grandfather. "What do you want, Beverly?" I asked, my voice sounding appropriately weak and raspy. She opened her designer bag and pulled out a crisp, rectangular piece of paper. She placed it face down on the sticky table and slowly slid it across the surface with one perfectly manicured finger. I looked down. It was a certified cashier's check made out directly to Frank Sullivan. The amount printed in bold black ink was $50,000. I stared at the numbers. $50,000. To a man who just counted out his last $4 in loose change, that piece of paper looked like a massive lifeline. But I knew exactly what it really was. It was 30 pieces of silver. It was the price tag she was placing on my daughter's sanity and my grandson's life. I looked back up at her, maintaining my pathetic facade. "I do not understand," I whispered, letting my large hands tremble slightly on the tabletop. "It is very simple," Frank Beverly said, leaning forward with an arrogant smirk. "You take that check. You pack your bags, and you leave the state of Ohio by midnight. You leave the boy with me right now. Trent will raise his son in a proper home with real opportunities. In exchange, you get to retire somewhere warm and pretend none of this ever happened." I looked down at Leo. He was happily drinking his milk, completely unaware of the absolute monster sitting across from us. "And what about Chloe?" I asked, keeping my voice pitched in a desperate, pleading tone. "What happens to my daughter?" Beverly let out a sharp, cruel laugh. "Your daughter is a lost cause, Frank. She is going to be permanently committed to a locked psychiatric facility by the end of the week. Trent has the medical evaluations. The police have the initial reports. It is already done. She is legally insane, and there is absolutely nothing you can do to save her." I let out a fake sob, covering my face with my rough hands. As I brought my hands up to my chest, I subtly pressed the record button on the cheap burner phone I had hidden deep inside the breast pocket of my thick flannel shirt. I had bought the phone at a gas station an hour ago for exactly this kind of situation. I needed her to keep talking. I needed her massive, untreated ego to dig her own grave. "Why are you doing this to her?" I begged, looking at Beverly with wide, defeated eyes. "Chloe never did anything to you. Why did Trent drug her coffee? Why did he ruin her life like this?" Beverly rolled her eyes, clearly annoyed by my emotional display. She leaned in closer, her voice dropping to a harsh, venomous whisper. "Because she was entirely disposable, Frank. Trent is involved in some very complex commercial real estate ventures. Things got slightly complicated with his investors. He needed a buffer. He needed someone to hold the liability for a few corporate entities. We chose your daughter. She was naive, she was trusting, and quite frankly, she was nobody important." I kept my chest perfectly still, ensuring the hidden microphone in my pocket was capturing every single syllable. "You forged her signature on those $2 million loan documents," I stammered, acting completely horrified. "You stole all that money and blamed it on her." Beverly smiled proudly. Her arrogance was absolutely blinding. Trent facilitated the transfers, she bragged openly. "But I am a senior vice president at the bank, Frank. I personally processed the commercial loan. I personally stamped the notary seals on the financial documents. It was incredibly easy. I just needed Chloe to be incapacitated so she could never dispute the signatures. So Trent slipped a few pills into her morning coffee every day. It was a brilliant and painless solution." I gripped the edge of the table under the booth. It took every ounce of self-control in my 68-year-old body not to reach across the table and flip it over. I forced myself to shrink back into the vinyl seat. "But why Chloe?" I asked, my voice trembling perfectly. "Why target my little girl?" Beverly looked at me with absolute, unvarnished hatred. "Because blue-collar trash like Chloe deserves to take the fall for a real family," she sneered. "You people are nothing but dirt under our shoes. My son is a visionary. He deserves wealth. He deserves power. He needed a scapegoat, and your pathetic daughter fit the bill perfectly. Now her name is on every single fraudulent wire transfer. The federal government will lock her in a cage, and Trent will walk away completely clean." She tapped a sharp fingernail against the $50,000 check. "So you have a choice to make, mechanic. You can take this money and walk away, or you can try to fight us. If you fight us, I will call my brother. He is a district court judge in this very county. I will have him issue a bench warrant for your immediate arrest for grand larceny and child endangerment. I will make sure you die in a prison cell, and I will still take my grandson. You have absolutely no money left, Frank. I froze your accounts myself. You have no power. You are a greasy mechanic playing a game with masters of the universe. Take the money and leave." I sat there in the silence of the diner. The only sound was the clinking of silverware from the front counter, and Leo happily humming a cartoon song next to me. I looked at the $50,000 check. Then, I looked at Beverly Harrison. I stopped trembling. I slowly straightened my back and let my broad, heavy shoulders fill the space of the booth. The broken, defeated old man vanished completely. The real Frank Sullivan returned. I saw a tiny flicker of confusion cross Beverly's smug face. I reached across the table and picked up the check. I held it between my calloused fingers. Then slowly and deliberately I tore the piece of paper in half. Beverly gasped, her eyes widening in pure shock. I tore the check again into quarters and dropped the shredded pieces directly into her open designer handbag sitting on the table. "You are right about one thing, Beverly," I said, my voice low, rumbling, and completely devoid of fear. "I am just a greasy mechanic. But you masters of the universe forgot a very basic rule of mechanics. If you push a pressure valve too far, it does not just break. It explodes." I slid out of the booth and lifted Leo gently into my arms. I wrapped his little coat tightly around him. Beverly was staring at me, her mouth opening and closing in absolute disbelief. I looked down at her one last time, making sure she saw the absolute fire burning in my eyes. "You thought you cornered a terrified old man," I told her. "You did not. You just handed me the very wrench I needed to dismantle your entire life. Keep your money, Beverly. You are going to need every penny of it for the prison commissary." I turned my back on her and walked toward the diner exit. I pulled my burner phone out of my flannel pocket and pressed the stop button on the recording application. The audio file was perfectly saved. I pushed open the glass door and walked out into the freezing Ohio morning feeling like a giant ready for war. I drove back to my house from the diner with the cheap burner phone resting heavy in my pocket. I could still feel the phantom weight of the $50,000 check Beverly Harrison had tried to bribe me with. I had her completely trapped on that audio recording. She had arrogantly confessed to notarizing fraudulent loan documents and helping her son drug my daughter. I thought we finally had a moment to breathe and plan our next move. I thought my solid brick house on the edge of town would offer us a temporary sanctuary from the madness. But the Harrison family did not fight fair, and they certainly did not know how to wait for the legal process to play out. Trent must have known his mother failed at the diner. He was a cornered animal, and cornered animals strike with unpredictable and terrifying violence. I had barely put my keys on the kitchen counter when the heavy rumble of engines tore through the quiet afternoon outside my window. I walked over and looked through the living room blinds. 2 unmarked white sedans and a local police cruiser pulled violently into my driveway, tearing up the frozen mud in my front yard. Heavy car doors slammed shut in unison. 4 people marched aggressively up my front walkway. 2 were uniformed police officers, with their hands resting on their duty belts. The other 2 were civilians wearing heavy winter coats with state identification badges hanging loosely from their lanyards. It was Child Protective Services. Trent had not waited for his mother's bribe to work. He had called in his corrupt favors and sent the government to forcefully steal my grandson from my own home. Chloe let out a shattered gasp from the kitchen. She grabbed little Leo and backed into the far corner of the living room, shaking like a leaf caught in a bitter winter storm. Her eyes were wide with a primal maternal terror that broke my heart all over again. I moved instantly. I slammed the deadbolt shut and threw the heavy brass chain lock across the door. I turned to my daughter and told her to take Leo into the back bedroom and lock the solid wood door behind her. I told her that no matter what she heard, she was not to come out until I explicitly said it was safe. The pounding on the front door started immediately. It was incredibly loud and aggressive, shaking the glass panes in the window frames. A woman with a sharp nasal voice shouted through the wood, demanding that I open the door right now under the supreme authority of the State Child Welfare Division. She loudly claimed they had an emergency removal order for Leo based on highly credible reports of severe maternal drug abuse and extreme child endangerment. I did not open the door. I leaned my broad back against the heavy wood and pulled out my cell phone. I needed a heavy hitter to fight this battle. I needed a shark. I dialed the only lawyer in the entire county who was meaner and smarter than Trent Harrison. Her name was Sarah Higgins. Sarah was a razor-sharp, aggressive family attorney who had built her entire reputation on tearing arrogant men apart in the courtroom. Years ago, when she was just starting her law practice, she could barely afford to keep her beat-up sedan running. I had spent countless hours in my shop fixing her transmission and doing brake jobs for absolutely free just so she could make it safely to her court hearings. We traded my dirty mechanic work for her brilliant legal advice, and over the years she became one of my closest allies. She answered the phone on the very second ring. I quickly and clearly explained the terrifying situation unfolding on my front porch. I told her Trent was using forged psychiatric holds and that a corrupt supervisor from Child Protective Services was currently trying to kick my front door down to take my grandson. Sarah told me to keep the door bolted shut and to not say a single word to the agents outside. She told me to give her exactly 12 minutes to get to my house. The pounding on my front door grew completely frantic. The woman outside loudly identified herself as Supervisor Miller. She shouted through the wood that if I did not surrender the child immediately, she would order the police officers to breach the door and arrest me for violently interfering with a state investigation. I stood there staring at the heavy brass lock, praying it would hold against a forced entry. I knew the local police officers were just following their dispatch orders, but Supervisor Miller was clearly on Trent's payroll. Trent had heavily greased her palms to push this emergency removal order through without conducting any actual investigation or standard welfare checks. He desperately needed Leo as physical leverage to break Chloe completely and force her to take the fall for his massive financial crimes. I kept my mouth firmly shut. I listened closely as the officers outside started loudly discussing whether they actually had the legal authority to break down a citizen's door without a signed physical warrant from a presiding judge. The minutes crawled by like agonizing hours. Every single second felt like a heavy steel hammer slamming against my chest. I could hear Leo crying softly in the back bedroom, and it fueled the burning fire in my blood. Just as the police officers finally stepped back to retrieve a heavy steel breaching tool from the trunk of their cruiser, a sleek silver car skidded wildly into my driveway. The car stopped mere inches from the police bumper, throwing freezing mud onto the squad car. Sarah Higgins stepped out into the freezing cold afternoon air, wearing a sharp dark suit and carrying a thick leather briefcase. I cracked my front window open just a few inches so I could hear the exchange. Sarah marched straight up the concrete walkway, stepping directly between the armed police officers and my front porch. She did not even look at the cops. She locked her fierce, uncompromising eyes completely on Supervisor Miller. Sarah demanded to see the physical removal order immediately. Supervisor Miller puffed out her chest and smugly handed over a stack of paperwork claiming it was a sealed psychiatric emergency mandate signed by a local magistrate. Sarah took one look at the papers and laughed a harsh, unforgiving laugh right in the corrupt supervisor's face. Sarah pulled a thick document from her own leather briefcase. It was the certified independent toxicology report we had miraculously secured from the rural clinic that very morning. Sarah shoved the medical report directly into Supervisor Miller's chest, forcing the woman to step backward. She loudly told the supervisor and the listening police officers that the psychiatric hold Trent provided was completely fraudulent and entirely illegal. She forcefully declared that Chloe was absolutely not a drug addict, but rather the victim of a systematic and involuntary chemical poisoning orchestrated by her own husband. Sarah pointed a manicured finger at the official clinic seal and stated that the toxicology report was certified by an independent, out-of-county physician. She explained that the blood test proved beyond a shadow of a doubt that the heavy sedatives in Chloe's system were completely unprescribed and forcibly administered against her will. Sarah did not stop there. She knew exactly how to handle bullies who hid behind a state badge. She stepped even closer to Supervisor Miller and lowered her voice to a dangerous and icy pitch. She told Miller that she knew exactly who was padding her bank account to bypass the standard child welfare protocols. She said that if Miller laid a single finger on my grandson based on forged documents funded by Trent Harrison, Sarah would personally file a massive federal civil rights lawsuit by the end of the day. She aggressively threatened to drag Miller's name through federal court, expose her corrupt financial ties to the Harrison real estate empire, and ensure she completely lost her state pension. Sarah promised to have Miller formally charged with federal kidnapping and criminal child abduction. Supervisor Miller turned entirely pale. The smug and arrogant confidence melted off her face in a matter of seconds. Corrupt government officials are always incredibly brave when they think they are dealing with poor and helpless victims who do not know the law. But the very moment a legal shark like Sarah Higgins threatens their pension and their personal freedom, they always crumble. The police officers looking closely over the conflicting medical reports realized they were caught directly in the middle of a massive and dangerous legal liability. The commanding police officer shook his head and firmly told Supervisor Miller they would absolutely not execute a forced entry without a direct and verified order from a superior court judge. Miller snatched her fraudulent papers back from Sarah with trembling hands. She glared at the lawyer and yelled that this situation was far from over. She said the state would grant us exactly 48 hours before a mandatory emergency hearing in federal family court. She promised she would return on Friday morning with a federal judge to take the boy away permanently. Then she turned around in a panic and marched rapidly back to her unmarked sedan. The police officers slowly followed her off my property. The flashing lights disappeared down the dark, wet road, leaving my front yard in sudden and profound silence. I quickly unlocked the heavy front door and pulled Sarah inside out of the freezing cold air. Chloe came tentatively out of the back bedroom, holding Leo tightly against her chest, with tears streaming down her pale face. She walked over and hugged Sarah so hard she nearly knocked the lawyer completely over. I asked Sarah what the 48-hour deadline meant for our situation. We all sat down at my small wooden kitchen table, and Sarah laid out the stark and terrifying reality of the legal battlefield. Trent had pushed us into an incredibly tight corner by utilizing his corrupt government contacts, but he had also inadvertently revealed his own massive weakness. By throwing Child Protective Services at us with such reckless and desperate speed, he showed us his exact timeline. Trent was officially panicking. He needed Chloe legally incapacitated, and he desperately needed physical control of Leo to ensure Chloe would quietly take the fall for his $2 million Ponzi scheme. He was running completely out of time. Mitchell had told me earlier that Trent was planning to launder the stolen commercial loan money out of the country by Friday night. The mandatory emergency court hearing was now officially scheduled for Friday morning. Trent wanted to use that court hearing to finally and permanently destroy Chloe. He wanted to lock her away in a psychiatric ward, declare himself the sole guardian of the child, and then board a private plane with his stolen millions before the weekend even started. He thought he had the perfect timeline to execute his criminal escape. We had exactly 2 days to finalize our trap. The conflict had escalated to the absolute breaking point. We were no longer just trying to survive the night and hide from his private security thugs. We were actively setting up the ultimate ambush to catch a monster before he could flee the country. We had the certified toxicology report proving the physical abuse. We had Mitchell actively tracing the offshore bank accounts to prove the massive financial fraud. And most importantly, we had Beverly's arrogant and detailed confession safely recorded on my hidden burner phone, linking her directly to the forged notary stamps. Trent had relied on his wealth and his power to silence us, but he had drastically underestimated the relentless determination of a father protecting his child. We knew his plan, we knew his timeline, and we were going to be waiting for him at that Friday hearing, ready to dismantle his entire life, piece by piece. We had exactly 48 hours until the federal court hearing. Trent had pushed all his chips to the center of the table and tried to take my grandson by force. But he failed. Now, it was my turn to go on the offensive. I sat at my kitchen table with Mitchell and Sarah. Chloe was finally resting in the back room with little Leo safely in her arms. I looked at Mitchell and told him we needed the physical evidence. The digital trails he found were good, but Trent could always claim his computer was hacked. We needed the original forged documents. We needed the fake notary stamps. We needed the hard proof that Beverly and Trent were orchestrating this entire nightmare in the physical world. Mitchell nodded and opened his laptop right there on my scratched kitchen table. He told me that arrogant people like Beverly Harrison always have a hidden physical stash. They never keep the truly dirty secrets in their own homes or their primary bank vaults. They hide them where they think working-class folks and local cops cannot look. Mitchell ran a deep background search on Beverly. He dug into her past long before she married into the Harrison real estate empire. He found her maiden name. Then he ran that maiden name through commercial property leases and luxury rentals across the entire state. It took him 3 agonizing hours of relentless searching, but he finally found a solid hit. Beverly was renting a premium climate-controlled storage unit in a highly exclusive facility on the wealthy north side of the county. She rented it under her maiden name, completely off the books to keep it hidden from any standard financial audit. I stood up from the kitchen table and grabbed my heavy canvas tool bag. I looked at Mitchell and told him it was time to go for a ride in the dark. We left Sarah at the house to watch over Chloe and Leo. I fired up my old diesel truck, and we headed straight into the belly of the beast. The drive across the county line was long and incredibly tense. We left behind the cracked asphalt and flickering streetlights of our neighborhood and crossed into the wealthy, manicured suburbs where the Harrison family held all their power. The massive houses sat far back from the road behind high stone walls and iron gates. It made my blood boil to think that this absolute luxury was built on the backs of innocent people like my daughter. The storage facility was not like the rusty chain-link yards on our side of town. It looked more like a modern art museum or a high-end corporate office. It was a massive brick and glass building surrounded by a 10-foot wrought iron fence with high-definition security cameras mounted on every single corner. The front gate was a heavy steel barrier controlled by a complex electronic keypad system. Mitchell looked at the cameras and the glowing keypad and told me we were going to trigger a silent alarm if we tried to force it open with brute strength. I smiled a cold and very hard smile in the darkness of the truck cab. I told him I had spent 40 years rewiring massive diesel engines and bypassing computerized locking mechanisms on heavy freight machinery that cost more than this entire building. I grabbed a small diagnostic scanner from my tool bag and walked quietly up to the electronic keypad. The rain had finally stopped, but the night air was bitterly cold. I knelt down on the damp pavement and popped the plastic cover off the keypad, using a simple flathead screwdriver. Inside was a tangled mess of colored wires and a small green circuit board. Trent and Beverly relied on expensive technology to keep their dark secrets safe. But technology is just a machine, and I know exactly how machines think. I attached the copper clips of my diagnostic scanner to the primary power wires feeding into the magnetic lock. I sent a low voltage surge directly into the bypass relay. It was an old trick I learned decades ago when I had to jumpstart locked commercial freight trucks stranded on the icy highway in the dead of winter. The electronic lock hummed quietly for a fraction of a second, and then the heavy steel gate slowly slid open. No alarms went off. No flashing police lights triggered. We slipped through the narrow gap like ghosts, and I wired the gate to close silently right behind us so no one would know we were inside. We walked through the pristine hallways of the storage facility. The floors were polished concrete, and the air smelled like expensive cleaning supplies and artificial pine. We walked past rows of identical orange doors until we found the unit registered under Beverly's maiden name on the 3rd floor. The rolling metal door was secured by a heavy-duty commercial padlock. Mitchell reached into his dark jacket pocket and pulled out a set of delicate lockpicks, but I shook my head. I did not have time for delicate solutions. I pulled a pair of heavy steel bolt cutters from my canvas bag. I clamped the forged steel jaws onto the thick shackle of the padlock and squeezed the long handles with all the raw strength in my thick, scarred arms. The metal snapped with a dull, satisfying thud. We pushed the rolling door up and stepped inside the pitch-black unit. Mitchell clicked on a small tactical flashlight. The bright beam of light swept across the unit, revealing exactly what we expected to find. The room was not filled with old furniture or dusty family photo albums. It was a sterile and perfectly organized space. In the dead center of the room sat a massive, solid steel floor safe. It was a heavy industrial piece of equipment painted matte black with a thick chrome combination dial on the front. It looked completely impenetrable. Mitchell shined his light on the dial and let out a frustrated sigh. He told me we were stuck. He said we could not blow it open without bringing the entire local police department down on our heads, and we absolutely did not have the combination. I dropped my heavy canvas tool bag onto the polished concrete floor. I told Mitchell that every single lock in the world is just a series of mechanical tumblers waiting to fall into place. I reached deep into my bag and pulled out my old mechanic's stethoscope. It was a trusted tool I had used for decades to listen to the internal valves of massive diesel engines, to hear the exact moment a piston misfired or a hidden gear slipped out of place. I placed the earpieces into my ears and pressed the cold metal disc of the stethoscope directly against the heavy steel door of the safe, right next to the combination dial. I closed my eyes and tuned out the entire outside world. I did not hear the low hum of the facility climate control system. I did not hear Mitchell breathing nervously behind me. I only focused on the cold, hard steel beneath my calloused hands. I gripped the chrome dial and began to turn it incredibly slowly to the right. I listened for the microscopic metallic click of the first internal pin dropping into the gate. It required absolute precision and immense patience. My thick fingers moved the dial millimeter by millimeter. I heard a faint sound echo through the rubber tubes of the stethoscope. I stopped immediately and reversed the direction, turning the dial slowly to the left. I thought about Chloe shivering in the freezing rain on the sidewalk. I thought about little Leo crying in the dark bedroom while corrupt state agents tried to break down my front door. That profound fatherly anger gave my hands a surgical and absolute steadiness. I heard another faint sound. The second tumbler fell perfectly into place. I turned the dial back to the right, keeping my breathing shallow and completely controlled. I could feel the internal mechanics of the heavy lock yielding to my gentle touch. The wealthy elites who built this safe thought it was completely secure against common thieves and working-class trash. But they did not account for a determined father who had spent a lifetime listening to the very heartbeat of broken machines. I heard the third and final pin drop with a heavy internal clunk. I grabbed the heavy chrome handle and pulled downward with all my weight. The massive steel door swung open smoothly on its hinges, revealing the dark, hidden interior of the vault. Mitchell stepped forward and shined his flashlight into the open safe. We had found the absolute heart of Trent's criminal empire. The safe was packed with neat stacks of thick manila folders and leather-bound ledger books. Mitchell reached in and pulled out the first heavy ledger. He opened it, and his eyes widened in the bright beam of the flashlight. He told me these were the original accounting books. His voice was thick with utter vindication. Trent kept a secondary set of physical books to track the real stolen money. Every single stolen dollar, every offshore wire transfer, and every fraudulent commercial loan was documented right here in his own arrogant handwriting. I reached into the safe and pulled out a small black velvet pouch. I opened it and dumped the heavy contents into my large palm. Out fell 3 heavy brass notary stamps. I looked closely at the engraved lettering on the bottom of the stamps. They were the exact official state notary seals that Beverly had used to forge the $2 million commercial loan documents. She had hidden the physical stamps here to ensure the federal police would never find them in her executive office at the regional bank. We finally had the undeniable physical proof of her direct involvement in the massive fraud. But the most damning piece of evidence was sitting entirely alone on the bottom shelf of the safe. It was a thick brown envelope securely taped shut. I ripped it open and pulled out 2 crisp blue booklets. They were valid international passports. One belonged to Trent Harrison, and the other belonged to Beverly Harrison. Tucked neatly inside the pages of the passports were 2 first-class plane tickets printed on heavy premium card stock. The tickets were booked for a direct international flight to a small island nation with absolutely no extradition treaty with the United States government. I looked closely at the departure date printed on the tickets. It was this coming Friday night. The flight was scheduled to leave exactly 10 hours after the mandatory emergency court hearing with Child Protective Services. The entire twisted and deeply evil plan was finally laid bare right in front of my eyes. Trent never intended to stick around and fight a long custody battle in family court. He never intended to raise my grandson or build a life in our state. He and his corrupt mother had orchestrated the $2 million fraud, funneled the stolen cash into untraceable offshore accounts, and meticulously planned their grand escape. They were going to use the Friday morning court hearing to permanently strip Chloe of her maternal rights and have her formally committed to a locked psychiatric ward. With Chloe legally incapacitated and declared legally insane, she would be the perfect tragic scapegoat when the federal authorities finally uncovered the massive Ponzi scheme. She would take the entire fall for the missing millions, and Trent would take my innocent grandson board a private first-class flight on Friday evening and disappear into a life of absolute luxury, leaving my daughter to rot in a cold clinical cell for crimes she never committed. I stared at the plane tickets in my rough, grease-stained hands. The sheer magnitude of their cruelty was almost too much for my mind to comprehend. They viewed our lives as completely disposable. They thought they could tear my family apart, steal our future, and fly away across the ocean without facing a single consequence. I carefully placed the plane tickets, the forged notary stamps, and the physical ledgers into my heavy canvas tool bag. I zipped the bag shut and hoisted it onto my broad shoulder. I looked at Mitchell and told him we finally had everything we needed to utterly destroy them. Trent Harrison thought he was running a perfect and flawless timeline. He thought Friday was going to be the glorious day he achieved his ultimate victory. But he did not know that a tired old diesel mechanic had just dismantled the very foundation of his criminal escape plan. We walked out of the climate-controlled storage facility and stepped back into the bitter Ohio night. The cold air felt sharp and clean in my lungs. I climbed back into the driver's seat of my truck and placed the bag of physical evidence securely on the floorboards. We were not going to run anymore. We were not going to hide in my house and wait for the corrupt local court system to dictate our fate. We were going to take this evidence, and we were going to build a trap so devastating and so absolute that Trent and Beverly would never see it coming. We drove back to my house in total silence. The heavy canvas tool bag sitting on the floorboards of my truck held the keys to Trent Harrison's absolute destruction. But having the physical evidence was only half the battle. I knew exactly how local politics worked in our county. I had lived here long enough to see how the system operates when money and power are involved. If I walked into the local police precinct with those ledgers and the fake notary stamps, the desk sergeant would take one look at the names and immediately call Beverly Harrison's brother the local judge. The evidence would miraculously disappear from the evidence locker before the sun even came up. I could absolutely not rely on the local authorities. I needed a hammer much bigger and much heavier than the local police department. I needed the federal government, but to get the federal authorities involved in time, I had to keep Trent completely blind to our discovery. I needed to make him believe he was winning right up until the very last second. I walked into my kitchen and sat down at my worn wooden table. I stared at the cheap plastic burner phone resting in my large hands. It was time to swallow my pride and play the hardest and most painful role of my entire life. I had to become the exact, pathetic, broken, and helpless old man that Trent Harrison believed me to be. I had to feed his massive ego until he choked on it. I took a deep breath, closed my eyes, and dialed Trent's personal cell phone number. He answered on the fourth ring. The background noise sounded like clinking glasses and soft jazz music. He was probably sitting in some high-end restaurant celebrating his supposed victory over my family. His voice was thick with smug satisfaction and absolute arrogance. He did not even bother to say hello. He just asked if I was calling to beg for mercy, or if I was calling to ask for visiting hours at the psychiatric ward, where he planned to lock my daughter away. I gripped the edge of the kitchen table and forced my voice to crack. I let my breathing sound shallow, terrified, and utterly defeated. I told him I was done fighting. I told him he had won the war. I said my bank accounts were completely frozen, my daughter was terrified out of her mind, and I had absolutely no money left to hire a lawyer to fight his emergency custody order. I begged him to call off the local police and drop the kidnapping charges. I told him I was an old man with a bad heart, and I did not want to spend the rest of my short life rotting in a prison cell. Trent laughed. It was a cold, hollow, and genuinely evil sound that made my stomach turn violently. He told me I should have thought about the consequences before I decided to play the hero and interfere with his family business. He said he was going to take his son back, commit my daughter to a locked state facility, and leave me to starve in my empty house. He wanted me to suffer. That is exactly when I dangled the ultimate bait. I knew Trent was drowning in toxic commercial debt. Mitchell had shown me the red ink in his ledgers. Trent desperately needed clean liquid and untraceable cash to finalize his escape from the country. I told Trent I had something he wanted. I told him I owned the land and the commercial building of my diesel mechanic shop completely outright. I had paid off the mortgage 20 years ago. I said the prime commercial property was recently appraised at $500,000. I offered to sign the entire deed over to him free and clear, abandoning my life's work to his real estate portfolio. I told him I would give him the shop and hand over the boy if he would just leave Chloe out of the criminal charges and let us walk away in peace. I told him he could sell the land, keep the cash, and walk away a richer man as long as he promised not to send my innocent daughter to a federal penitentiary. I listened to the dead silence on the other end of the phone line. I could practically hear the gears turning in his greedy, desperate mind. Trent was a textbook narcissist and a failing con artist. He could not resist the opportunity to steal $500,000 in prime real estate from a working-class man he despised. To him, my mechanic shop was just another valuable asset to quickly liquidate for his international getaway fund. It was the perfect icing on his criminal cake. Finally, Trent spoke. His voice was practically dripping with superiority and absolute contempt. He told me I was making the first smart decision of my miserable, worthless life. He accepted the deal. But Trent could not just take the deed in a quiet lawyer's office. His fragile ego demanded a public, humiliating victory. He wanted to break me. He wanted me to hand over my life's work and my grandson while he was standing on his highest pedestal. Trent told me he was hosting a massive corporate charity gala on Friday evening at the Grand Ballroom in the center of the city. He was scheduled to receive a prestigious real estate development award in front of the mayor, the city council, and all of his wealthy, corrupt investors. He ordered me to bring the signed property deed and my grandson directly to the gala. He said I would walk into his private back room, hand over the papers and the boy, and walk out with my pathetic life. He told me if I tried to pull any tricks, if I brought the police, or if I tried to cause a scene, he would have his armed security team throw me to the dirt, and he would ensure Chloe was locked in a padded cell before midnight. I kept my voice perfectly meek and submissive. I told him I would be there on Friday night exactly as he asked. I promised him I would not cause any trouble, and that I just wanted this nightmare to end. I hung up the phone and set it gently down on the table. A slow, hard, and incredibly dangerous smile spread across my weathered face. Trent had just sealed his own fate. He had invited me right into the absolute center of his public world on the exact night he was planning to flee the country. I looked over at Mitchell. My old military friend was already nodding, a fierce light burning in his eyes. He knew exactly what had to happen next. We needed to hand our stolen evidence over to someone who possessed the unyielding power to shut down an international airport and arrest a room full of corrupt billionaires. I picked up my phone again and called Sarah Higgins. I told our fierce family lawyer that we had successfully secured the physical proof of the entire fraud operation, and we needed her absolute best connection in federal law enforcement right now. Sarah did not hesitate. She told me to gather the documents and bring the evidence to a secure location immediately. An hour later, Mitchell and I walked into a quiet, dimly lit, and unassuming diner 2 towns over, far away from Trent's sphere of influence. Sarah was sitting in a secluded back booth with a stern-looking man wearing a plain gray suit. The man introduced himself as Special Agent Reynolds from the Federal Bureau of Investigation. He specialized in massive corporate fraud racketeering and international money laundering. He had the kind of sharp, unblinking eyes that missed absolutely nothing. I sat down across from the federal agent and placed my heavy canvas tool bag onto the table with a solid thud. I unzipped the bag and pulled out the physical ledgers we had stolen from Beverly's climate-controlled storage unit. I placed the 3 heavy brass fake notary stamps right next to the ledgers. Then I pulled out the international passports and the first-class plane tickets proving Trent and his mother were planning to flee the country on Friday night. Finally, I placed my cheap burner phone on the table and hit play on the audio file. Special Agent Reynolds sat in absolute stunned silence as Beverly Harrison's arrogant voice filled the quiet booth. He listened to her explicitly confess to forging the $2 million commercial loan documents. He listened to her brag with chilling cruelty about poisoning my daughter with heavy sedatives to make her a compliant, silent scapegoat. He listened to her threaten to use her brother, the local judge, to have me thrown in a concrete jail cell if I did not take her dirty bribe. When the recording finished, the federal agent let out a long, heavy breath. He looked at the mountain of undeniable physical and audio evidence sitting in front of him. He looked at me, a retired diesel mechanic in a grease-stained flannel shirt, and shook his head in absolute disbelief. He told me his department had been quietly looking into Trent Harrison's real estate companies for over 6 months, but they could never find the physical paper trail connecting Trent to the missing investor funds. They knew Trent was running a massive Ponzi scheme, but Trent had hidden his tracks behind incredibly complex legal walls and corrupt local officials. Agent Reynolds told me that in one single night, I had handed him the holy grail of financial crime evidence. I had handed him the exact accounting blueprint of the fraud, the physical tools used to forge the state documents, the undeniable flight risk evidence, and a legally recorded confession from the primary banking accomplice. I looked the federal agent dead in the eye. I told him I did not care about the real estate fraud. I did not care about the rich investors who lost their money. I only cared about my daughter and my grandson. I told him Trent Harrison had chemically tortured my little girl and tried to steal my family using the legal system as a weapon. I told him I had a meeting scheduled with Trent at his corporate charity gala on Friday night. I said I was going to walk into that ballroom and pretend to hand Trent the deed to my mechanic shop. I told the agent I wanted him and his entire federal team waiting in the wings. I wanted them to let Trent think he had won. I wanted Trent to stand on that stage and look out at his wealthy friends believing he was the smartest, most powerful man in the world. And then I wanted the Federal Bureau of Investigation to tear his world apart in front of every single person he ever tried to impress. Agent Reynolds looked at the passports and the plane tickets. He knew Trent was a massive flight risk. He knew if they waited until Monday, Trent and Beverly would be sitting on a tropical beach in a country with no extradition treaty, and my daughter would be locked in a federal prison, taking the blame for everything. The agent reached across the table and shook my calloused hand with deep respect. He told me the FBI would take full custody of the evidence right now. He promised me that by Friday evening, he would have a small army of federal agents surrounding the grand ballroom. He said they would lock down all the exits, secure the entire perimeter, and wait for my signal. Sarah Higgins sat next to me with a fierce and proud smile on her face. She told Agent Reynolds she would be drafting the federal injunctions to immediately clear Chloe's name and dissolve the fraudulent custody orders the very second Trent was placed in handcuffs. We left the diner and walked back out to my truck. The freezing rain had finally stopped, and the heavy gray clouds were beginning to break apart. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, I could see the faint light of the moon shining through the winter sky. The bait was officially set. The federal trap was armed and ready to snap shut. Trent Harrison had spent 3 years looking down on me because I worked with my hands. He thought I was just a dumb old man who fixed broken engines for a living. He was about to learn that the hands of a mechanic know exactly how to apply the perfect amount of pressure to make a corrupt machine completely self-destruct. I drove back to my house feeling a deep and powerful sense of peace. I walked into the back bedroom and checked on Chloe and Leo. They were sleeping soundly, completely unaware of the massive storm that was about to rain down on the monster who hurt them. I sat down in my armchair, closed my eyes, and waited for Friday to arrive. Friday evening arrived with a bitter chill in the air, but a profound heat burning in my chest. I stood in front of the small mirror in my bedroom, adjusting the collar of my old Sunday suit. It was dark navy wool, slightly faded at the elbows, and a little tight across my broad shoulders. It was not a $5,000 designer outfit like the men in Trent's world wore. It smelled faintly of mothballs and old memories. I looked at my reflection, seeing the deep lines carved into my face by 40 years of hard labor, and the permanent grease stains worked deep into the calluses of my hands. But I did not feel out of place. I felt like a soldier putting on his armor for the final battle of his life. I walked out into the living room. Chloe was waiting for me, and the sight of her made my old heart swell with absolute pride. She was no longer the fragile, trembling ghost I had carried out of that house just a few days ago. The toxic chemicals were completely flushed from her system. Her color had returned. Her posture was straight and unyielding. She wore a simple dark dress, and her jaw was set with a fierce maternal determination. She looked incredibly strong. She looked furious. She looked ready to take back her life. Sarah Higgins stood right beside her, holding her thick leather briefcase that contained every legal document we needed to completely dismantle the Harrison family. Mitchell gave me a slow, firm nod from the kitchen doorway, where he was packing up his specialized electronic equipment. He had a very specific job to do tonight, and he never failed a mission. We drove into the heart of the city in my heavy diesel truck. The streets grew brighter, and the buildings grew taller as we approached the grand ballroom where Trent was hosting his corporate charity gala. It was a massive, ornate building with marble columns and sweeping glass windows. Expensive luxury cars were lined up around the block waiting for valets in crisp white shirts to take their keys. We parked around the back near the loading docks. Mitchell slipped out of the truck with a heavy duffel bag slung over his shoulder, heading straight for the utility entrance to find the main audio-visual control room. Sarah, Chloe, and I walked around to the front doors. The crisp winter wind bit at our faces, but we did not slow our pace. We walked right through the towering brass doors and stepped into the main lobby. The air was warm and smelled of expensive perfume and roasted meats. We moved past the velvet ropes, completely ignoring the confused security guards who were too shocked by my sheer size and grim expression to actually step in my way. We approached the massive double mahogany doors leading into the main ballroom. I could hear the muted sound of applause coming from inside. I placed my large hands flat against the polished wood of the doors. I looked at my daughter. She gave me one single, determined nod. I pushed the doors open with a heavy, violent thud that echoed like a cannon shot over the polite applause. The ballroom was a sea of absolute luxury. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm, golden glow over dozens of round tables covered in pristine white linen and expensive silver centerpieces. Hundreds of wealthy investors, local politicians, and corporate executives sat in their tailored suits and expensive gowns. Sitting right in the front row was Beverly Harrison, wearing a glittering diamond necklace and looking incredibly smug. And standing up on the brightly lit stage behind a polished wooden podium was Trent Harrison. Trent was wearing a perfectly tailored tuxedo. He was holding a heavy glass award in one hand and leaning into the microphone. We had interrupted him right in the middle of a grand speech about community leadership and the importance of deep family values. He was actually standing there lecturing a room full of people about business integrity and moral responsibility. The sheer hypocrisy of his words made the blood rush to my ears. The heavy thud of the doors opening caused the entire ballroom to go completely silent. Hundreds of heads turned to look at the back of the room. Trent stopped speaking mid-sentence. His arrogant smile froze and then completely shattered when he saw us standing there. I walked slowly down the center aisle. My heavy work boots hit the polished hardwood floor with a slow, rhythmic, and terrifying cadence. Chloe walked right by my side, her head held high, staring absolute daggers directly into the soul of the man who had tried to destroy her. Sarah flanked our other side, projecting the cold, aggressive confidence of a legal shark smelling blood in the water. Trent gripped the edges of the podium so hard his knuckles turned white. His face went pale, and his eyes darted around the room in absolute panic. He looked down at his mother. Beverly had half risen from her chair, her mouth hanging open in pure shock. She had expected me to be halfway across the country by now, fleeing like a coward with her dirty $50,000 bribe. She never expected the poor old mechanic to walk right into her fortress of power. Trent leaned into this microphone and tried to project authority. His voice shook slightly, but he demanded that security immediately remove the disturbed individuals from the ballroom. He told the wealthy crowd that I was a violent and unhinged old man, and that my poor wife was suffering from a severe mental breakdown. He tried to play the role of the tragic protective husband one last time. 4 large security guards in dark suits started moving rapidly down the side aisles toward us. I did not stop walking. I did not raise my hands. I stepped right up to the very edge of the stage, looking up at Trent with a cold, unrelenting stare. I projected my deep, gravelly voice across the entire silent ballroom, telling Trent that his game was completely over. Sarah stepped forward and raised her heavy leather briefcase for the entire room to see, loudly announcing that she possessed certified medical and financial records proving Trent Harrison was a complete fraud and an abuser. The security guards reached us, grabbing my arms, but I planted my feet and refused to move a single inch. Trent yelled into the microphone, demanding they drag us out. But before another hand could be laid upon me, the bright stage light suddenly flickered and went entirely dark. Mitchell had done his job perfectly. Up in the control booth, he had completely hijacked the ballroom audio-visual system. A loud, sharp crackle of static echoed through the massive surround sound speakers mounted on the ceiling. Then a voice filled the room. It was not my voice. It was not Trent's voice. It was the sharp, arrogant, and unmistakable voice of Beverly Harrison. The audio recording from the diner played with crystal-clear digital perfection. Beverly's words rained down on the silent, shocked crowd like a meteor strike. Every single person in the ballroom heard her explicitly and proudly confess to personally forging the $2 million commercial loan documents. They heard her boast about overriding the banking security protocols. They heard her casually admit that Trent had been slipping heavy sedatives into my daughter's morning coffee for weeks to keep her incapacitated and compliant. The entire room listened in absolute horror as Beverly Harrison bragged about using innocent blue-collar people as disposable trash to take the fall for her son's massive financial crimes. The reaction was instantaneous and completely devastating. Gasps of shock and horror erupted from the tables. The wealthy investors who had trusted Trent with their millions suddenly realized their money was completely gone, stolen in a massive Ponzi scheme. The local politicians who had just been applauding Trent's integrity physically backed away from their tables, trying to distance themselves from the radioactive fallout. Beverly Harrison collapsed back into her chair, clutching her diamond necklace and hyperventilating. Her face was ashen gray. The pristine wall of untouchable wealth she had built her entire life upon had just crumbled into dust in front of her peers. Trent looked like a man who had just watched his own execution. The smug, arrogant master of the universe was completely gone. He dropped his expensive glass award. It hit the stage and shattered into 100 jagged pieces. The security guards who had been trying to grab me suddenly let go, stepping away in total confusion and fear. Trent realized in a split second that his entire empire was dead. He knew the local police could not save him from a recorded confession played in front of hundreds of witnesses. Blind, primal panic completely overtook him. He did not look at his mother. He did not try to explain. He just turned and bolted. He scrambled off the side of the stage, knocking over a microphone stand, and sprinted desperately toward the heavy velvet curtains that covered the rear exit doors. He thought he could escape into the dark alley and somehow make it to his private flight. He pushed through the heavy velvet curtains and slammed his body against the brass crash bar of the rear exit doors. The doors flew open. But Trent did not run out into the empty night. He ran directly into a solid wall of federal authority. The bright, strobing red and blue lights of unmarked federal vehicles illuminated the dark alley behind the ballroom. Standing in the open doorway, blocking the entire exit, was Special Agent Reynolds. Behind him stood a dozen heavily armed federal agents wearing tactical gear and dark windbreaker jackets with bright yellow letters on the back. Agent Reynolds was holding the heavy, original financial ledgers we had stolen from the storage unit right in his hands. Trent stumbled backward, slipping on the polished hardwood floor and crashing down onto his hands and knees. The federal agents swarmed into the ballroom, moving with swift, tactical precision. They surrounded Trent, hauling him roughly to his feet and pulling his arms behind his back. The sharp, metallic click of steel handcuffs echoed loudly over the murmuring crowd. Another team of agents marched directly down the center aisle, straight toward the front row. They surrounded Beverly Harrison, lifting her out of her chair by her expensive cashmere coat and securing her wrists in heavy steel cuffs. I stood at the edge of the stage with my daughter by my side. We watched the federal agents march Trent and Beverly Harrison right down the center of the grand ballroom, past the staring faces of their former friends and investors. Trent looked back at me over his shoulder as they pushed him toward the doors. His face was a mask of utter defeat and pathetic terror. I did not smile. I did not gloat. I just wrapped my heavy arm around my daughter's strong shoulders and pulled her close. We had walked into the lion's den, and we had completely torn the beast apart. The men who thought they were untouchable masters of the universe were now nothing more than common criminals walking out the door in chains. I looked down at the shattered pieces of Trent's glass award scattered across the edge of the wooden stage. It was the perfect physical representation of his fake life. It was fragile, transparent, and ultimately worthless. The investors in the room were now shouting, angrily demanding answers from the remaining event organizers. Some were pulling out their cell phones, frantically dialing their lawyers and bankers, trying to see if they could salvage any of their stolen money. The local politicians were quietly slipping out the side doors, hoping no one would remember they had attended a gala honoring a federal criminal. Sarah Higgins turned to me and gave me a firm, reassuring pat on my back. She told me she was heading straight to the federal courthouse to file the emergency paperwork that would completely void the fraudulent medical guardianship and clear Chloe's name from the fake corporate entities. She said Trent and Beverly would be sitting in federal holding cells without bail before the sun even thought about rising. Chloe rested her head against my shoulder and let out a long, trembling breath. The heavy burden of fear that had been crushing her spirit for months finally lifted away. She looked up at me with tears shining in her bright, clear eyes. She thanked me for not giving up on her. She thanked me for fighting when everything seemed completely impossible. I kissed the top of her head and told her that a father never stops fighting for his children. I told her that no matter how much money or power someone has, they can never break the bond of a family that stands together in the truth. Mitchell walked out from the side access door, brushing a bit of dust off his jacket. He had a tight, satisfied smile on his face. He walked over to us and simply nodded. The mission was accomplished. We turned our backs on the chaotic, wealthy ballroom and walked back out through the main doors. We stepped out into the crisp, clean winter night air. We had a long drive back to my house, but for the first time in a very long time, the road ahead looked incredibly bright and peaceful. We were going home to wake up little Leo and tell him that he was safe forever. I watched Trent Harrison grovel on the polished hardwood floor of the grand ballroom. The heavy mahogany doors stood wide open, and the cold night air rushed in, mixing with the thick smell of fear and expensive perfume. The man who had spent the last 3 years parading around like an untouchable king was now entirely on his hands and knees. The knees of his custom-tailored tuxedo were scuffed and smeared with dust from his frantic attempt to flee. 2 broad-shouldered federal agents gripped his arms and yanked him roughly upward. The sharp metallic clicking of the heavy steel handcuffs snapping shut around his manicured wrists echoed across the massive room. It was the absolute most beautiful sound I had ever heard in my entire 68 years of living on this earth. Trent struggled against the federal agents, but his soft country club muscles were absolutely no match for men who did this for a living. He looked utterly pathetic. All of his wealth and all of his arrogant superiority had been completely stripped away in a matter of seconds. He was just a terrified coward who realized his massive house of cards had finally and violently collapsed. He whimpered as the agents read him his rights, loudly reciting the long list of federal charges, including grand larceny wire fraud and interstate flight to avoid prosecution. Across the room, his mother, Beverly Harrison, was not going down quietly. Beverly had spent her entire adult life believing she was completely immune to consequences. She was a senior vice president at a regional bank. She controlled millions of dollars and dictated the lives of ordinary working-class people with the simple stroke of her executive pen. Now, 2 federal agents were attempting to place her under arrest in front of the mayor, the city council, and every wealthy investor she had ever tried to impress. Beverly shrieked at the top of her lungs. Her face was flushed dark purple with absolute rage and indignation. She screamed that they had no idea who she was. She demanded that someone call her brother, the local district judge, immediately. She yelled that she was a woman of immense standing in the community and that they were making a terrible and career-ending mistake. The federal agents remained completely calm and professional. They told her to place her hands behind her back. But Beverly was so blinded by her own bloated ego that she actually thought she could physically fight off the Federal Bureau of Investigation. When one of the agents reached out to secure her right wrist, Beverly let out a vicious scream and swung her arm wildly. Her hand cracked loudly across the face of the federal agent. The sharp slap echoed through the silent, shocked ballroom. It was the ultimate display of her toxic entitlement. She actually believed she was above the law and that she could strike a federal officer without any repercussions. The agents did not hesitate for a single second. In one swift and highly coordinated motion, they took Beverly down to the polished floor. Her expensive diamond necklace broke, sending tiny glittering stones scattering across the hardwood. She thrashed and kicked, screaming obscenities as the agents pinned her arms behind her back and locked the heavy steel cuffs around her wrists. The lead agent leaned down and informed her in a very calm and steady voice that she was now officially being charged with assaulting a federal officer and obstructing a federal investigation right on top of her massive financial fraud charges. She had just added years to her federal prison sentence, simply because she could not swallow her arrogant pride. I stood tall with my broad shoulders pulled back, watching the absolute destruction of the Harrison family. Chloe stood right beside me. My daughter did not look away. She watched the woman who had helped poison her being dragged off the floor in total disgrace. I could feel the heavy tension finally leaving Chloe's body. The nightmare was ending. The agents began to march Trent down the main aisle toward the front doors. As they dragged him past the spot where I was standing, Trent suddenly stopped planting his expensive leather shoes on the floor. The agents yanked his arms, but he looked up at me with wide, desperate, and completely terrified eyes. "Frank, please," he begged, his voice cracking and high-pitched. "Frank, you have to tell them to stop. Tell your lawyer to call off the federal agents. I will give you anything you want. I have millions hidden away. I will transfer $10 million into your account right now. You can have the house. You can have full custody of Leo. Just please make them stop. I cannot go to prison, Frank. I will not survive in there." He was actually crying. Real pathetic tears streamed down his pale face, ruining his perfectly groomed appearance. He was still trying to buy his way out of the consequences of his own evil actions. He thought everyone in the world had a price tag because that was the only way he knew how to operate. He thought he could chemically torture my daughter, try to steal my grandson, wipe out my entire life savings, and then just write me a fat check to make it all go away. I stepped forward. I closed the distance between us until I was standing directly over him. I looked down at the man who had caused my family so much agonizing pain. I did not raise my voice. I did not need to shout. I let my deep, raspy voice carry the absolute weight of 40 years of hard, honest labor. "I build engines, Trent," I told him, my voice low and incredibly hard. "I know how to take a broken machine apart piece by piece. You broke my daughter. So I dismantled your life." Trent stared at me, his mouth opening and closing silently like a suffocating fish. He finally realized that there was absolutely no amount of money in the world that could buy his way out of the trap I had built for him. The federal agents pulled him forward, dragging him through the grand mahogany doors and out into the cold night. The flashing red and blue lights of the police cruisers illuminated his terrified face as they shoved him into the back of a federal transport vehicle. I watched the taillights disappear down the long, manicured driveway. A profound and heavy silence settled over the grand ballroom. The wealthy investors and politicians were staring at us in absolute shock. They had just watched their golden boy completely exposed as a criminal monster. Sarah Higgins stepped forward, holding her thick leather briefcase. She looked around the room with a sharp, predatory smile. She told the remaining crowd that the show was officially over and suggested they all go home and call their financial advisors. We walked out of the ballroom and into the crisp, clean winter air. The immediate aftermath of that night was a whirlwind of relentless legal action. Sarah Higgins was an absolute force of nature. She did not sleep for the next 48 hours. Armed with the physical ledgers, the fake notary stamps, and Beverly's recorded confession, Sarah marched straight into the federal courthouse the very next morning. She met with the federal magistrate and presented the undeniable proof of Trent's criminal conspiracy. The bogus medical guardianship orders that Trent and Beverly had forged were immediately thrown out and physically shredded. The corrupt Child Protective Services supervisor, who had tried to break down my front door, was suspended without pay and placed under active federal investigation. The terrifying threat hanging over my grandson was completely and permanently eradicated. Leo was safe. The federal authorities moved with incredible speed. They officially cleared Chloe's name from every single shell company and fraudulent corporate entity Trent had created. They issued a formal statement exonerating her of any involvement in the $2 million commercial loan fraud. Trent's complex web of lies was completely untangled, and the truth was laid bare for the entire world to see. But Sarah did not stop there. She knew exactly how to hit Trent, where it hurt the absolute most. The federal government immediately seized all of Trent's frozen assets and offshore bank accounts to begin the long process of repaying the investors he had stolen from. But before the government could liquidate his entire portfolio, Sarah filed a massive civil restitution lawsuit on behalf of my daughter. She argued that Chloe was the victim of severe psychological and physical abuse, forced chemical incapacitation, and extreme financial distress. Because Sarah moved so aggressively, she was able to secure a massive financial payout from Trent's remaining legitimate equity before the federal asset forfeiture was finalized. She secured the deed to the massive luxury house Trent had kicked Chloe out of. She secured a multi-million-dollar trust fund completely dedicated to Leo's future education and care. And she ensured that my frozen bank accounts and my hard-earned pension were completely restored with a substantial penalty fee paid directly by the regional bank for their complicity in Beverly's illegal actions. In a matter of days, Trent Harrison went from being a wealthy, arrogant real estate developer to a disgraced federal inmate facing decades behind bars. Beverly Harrison lost her senior vice president title, her reputation, and her freedom, all because she thought she could treat working-class people like disposable garbage. They had built their entire lives on a foundation of greed and manipulation, and they had finally met a man who refused to be broken. A week later, I sat on the front porch of my solid brick house. The winter snow was beginning to melt away, leaving patches of green grass shining in the bright morning sun. Chloe was sitting next to me, holding a warm cup of coffee. Her hands were completely steady. She looked healthy and vibrant, and the dark shadows of fear were entirely gone from her beautiful face. Leo was playing in the front yard, chasing a yellow rubber ball and laughing loudly. I took a deep breath of the fresh air. I felt the comforting weight of my old gold retirement watch resting on my wrist again. The young clerk at the rural clinic had mailed it back to me the very next day, refusing to accept any money for it. It was a simple reminder that there are still good, honest people in this world. I watched my grandson run across the grass, and I knew that everything we had endured was completely worth it. We had faced pure evil, and we had not backed down. We had stood our ground and fought for the truth. Trent Harrison had tried to destroy us because he thought we were weak. But he learned the hardest lesson of his life. You can strip a man of his money, you can freeze his bank accounts, and you can try to take his home. But you can never take away the relentless, unyielding strength of a father protecting his family. My name is Frank Sullivan. I am just an old diesel mechanic. I spent 40 years turning wrenches and fixing broken machines, and when a corrupt, arrogant monster tried to dismantle my family, I simply returned the favor. I took his life apart piece by piece, and I threw the broken parts away. Now my family is safe, my daughter is free, and my grandson will grow up knowing exactly what it means to stand up and fight for what is right. It has been exactly 1 year and 2 months since the heavy wooden doors of that grand ballroom slammed shut on Trent Harrison's fake empire. I am sitting out here in the warm afternoon sun in my backyard in Ohio. The bitter freezing winds and the terrifying ice storms of that dark winter feel like they belong to an entirely different lifetime. Today, the sky is a brilliant, clear blue, and the air smells like fresh-cut grass and blooming honeysuckle. I am sitting on a worn wooden crate next to my old rusted project truck. Right beside me, with his hands covered in a thin layer of black motor oil, is my 4-year-old grandson, Leo. He is holding a heavy steel wrench that is almost as big as his entire forearm. I am showing him exactly how to grip the cold metal, how to find the right leverage, and how to turn a stubborn bolt without slipping. He grunts with effort, his little face scrunched up in deep concentration, and then he lets out a loud, joyful laugh when the bolt finally breaks loose. That laugh is the most beautiful sound in the entire world. It is the sound of absolute safety. A year ago, this precious boy was sitting in the back of my truck, wrapped in a heavy quilt, shivering and crying silently in the dark, while we ran for our lives. He was terrified of loud noises and terrified of the world. Now he is just a normal, happy little boy getting grease on his jeans and learning how to fix things with his grandfather. The back screen door of the house creaks open, and my daughter Chloe walks out onto the wooden deck. She is carrying a tray with tall glasses of iced tea and a plate of fresh homemade cookies. I look up at her, and my heart swells with a pride so massive it is hard to contain in my chest. You would never recognize her as the same woman from last winter. The pale, trembling ghost whose nervous system was violently crashing from heavy involuntary sedatives is completely gone. Today, Chloe is glowing with radiant health. Her cheeks are full of color, her eyes are bright and sharp, and her posture is straight and unyielding. She is wearing a simple summer dress, and her loud, confident laughter rings out across the yard as she watches Leo try to lift a heavy socket set. When Sarah Higgins, our fierce family lawyer, tore Trent's assets apart in federal court, she secured a massive restitution payout for Chloe. Sarah aggressively liquidated Trent's remaining legitimate equity before the government could seize it all for the investors. With that money, Chloe did not just recover, she completely rebuilt her life from the ground up. Her credit, which Trent and Beverly had intentionally destroyed to trap her, is now absolutely spotless. She took the settlement money and opened her own small interior design business right here in our town. She is thriving. She makes her own decisions. She controls her own finances, and she answers to absolutely no one. She is a completely free woman, and she earned every single ounce of that freedom by walking through absolute hell and coming out the other side stronger than iron. While we are sitting in the warm sunshine drinking sweet tea and watching the afternoon roll by, I sometimes allow my mind to briefly wander to the people who tried to destroy us. Trent Harrison and his mother Beverly are currently residing in a place where the sun does not shine nearly as bright. The federal justice system moves slowly, but when it finally drops the hammer, it drops it with crushing absolute force. The trial was a spectacular public humiliation for the Harrison family. They tried to hire expensive corporate defense attorneys to spin a web of lies, but the evidence we handed over to the FBI was completely insurmountable. The physical ledgers we pulled from the storage unit proved beyond a shadow of a doubt that Trent was running a massive multi-million-dollar Ponzi scheme. But it was the audio recording from the diner that truly sealed their fate. The federal jury listened in total stunned silence as Beverly's arrogant voice echoed through the courtroom, openly bragging about forging notary stamps and chemically poisoning my daughter to create a disposable scapegoat. There was no defense against their own words. The judge looked down at them from his bench with absolute disgust. He saw exactly what they were. They were greedy, soulless predators who believed their wealth made them entirely immune to human decency and the law. Trent and Beverly were both handed 15-year sentences in a maximum security federal prison. There is no early parole in the federal system. They will serve every single day of those 15 years locked in a concrete cell, stripped of their designer clothes, their luxury cars, and their false superiority. Trent, the golden boy of local real estate, is now just an inmate number. Beverly, the untouchable senior vice president who looked at my calloused hands like they were garbage, is now taking orders from prison guards. They thought money was the ultimate power in this universe. They worshipped greed, and they sacrificed their own family on its altar. Now they have absolutely nothing. I sit back and watch Leo chasing a yellow butterfly across the green lawn. His small legs pump with endless energy. Every time he stumbles, he gets right back up without a single tear. It is a profound miracle to witness the resilience of a child. When we first brought him home from that horrific night in the winter, he would wake up screaming from terrible nightmares. He would hide under his bed whenever a car drove past the house too quickly. The trauma Trent inflicted upon his own son was deep and entirely unforgivable. I spent countless nights sitting on the floor right beside Leo's bed, just holding his small hand in the dark and whispering stories to him until his breathing slowed down. Chloe spent hours holding him, rocking him, and assuring him that the bad men were gone forever. Healing is not a fast process. It is not something that happens overnight just because the villains are locked away. It takes immense patience and an overwhelming amount of consistent, unwavering love. But looking at him today, covered in backyard dirt, and laughing loudly at the summer breeze, I know we have won the most important battle of all. We saved his spirit. We saved his childhood. Chloe sits down in the lawn chair next to me and lets out a long, peaceful sigh. She looks out over the yard and tells me about a new client she signed for her design business. She speaks with a sharp, passionate energy. I remember the days when Trent had her completely convinced she was losing her mind. He used those heavy sedatives to slowly drain the light from her eyes, making her doubt her own memory and her own sanity. Gaslighting is a truly insidious form of torture. It dismantles a person's reality from the inside out. But watching her now, I see a woman who knows exactly who she is and exactly what she is worth. She took the darkest chapter of her life and turned it into fuel. She helps other women in our community who are going through difficult divorces and abusive situations, offering them advice and directing them to Sarah Higgins when they need a legal sword to fight back. Chloe did not just survive her trauma, she weaponized it for good. She became a beacon of strength for people who feel entirely helpless. I have never been more proud of another human being in my entire life. She looked directly into Trent's eyes and told the jury exactly how he had manipulated her reality, how he had secretly crushed heavy sedatives into her coffee, and how he had tried to weaponize the state child welfare system to steal her son. Her voice rang through the massive courtroom with pure, unbreakable clarity. I saw the jurors leaning forward, captivated by her strength and horrified by the sheer calculated evil of the man sitting at the defense table. That was the exact moment I knew Trent was completely finished. He could not charm his way out of the absolute truth.